In 2025, a border dispute between Cambodia and Thailand didn't just simmer, it absolutely exploded. Now, the headlines gave us the basics: airstrikes, ground assaults, and a really staggering human cost. But today, we're going much deeper. We're going to unpack the why, the strategic calculations, the shocking political betrayals, and the hidden triggers that turned a long-running feud into a full-blown war. So, here's how we're going to break down this dossier. First, we'll look at the shooting war itself, then the tragic humanitarian fallout. After that, and this is crucial, we'll dive into the political scandal that really lit the fuse. Then we'll cover the failed peace efforts, the military imbalance that shaped the fighting, and finally, the global power games playing out just behind the curtain. All right, let's start with how the battlefield just erupted. We're going to trace that chain of events that took this from a tense but manageable border standoff to a hot war, all kicked off by a single devastating explosion. The flashpoint came on July 23rd. A Thai soldier was horribly injured by a landmine. Now, for Thailand, this wasn't just some tragic accident. They saw it as a direct violation of their sovereignty, an inhumane act, and they immediately put their forces on combat readiness. That single event was the spark that was about to ignite the entire border. And the escalation was just brutally swift. I mean, within 24 hours, on July 24th, Thai F-16s were already in the air bombing Cambodian command posts. A day later, martial law was declared all along the border. By the 26th, the fight had spread to the sea, and a top Cambodian general was killed by artillery. And then, on the 27th, shells were falling on the historic Preah Vihear temple, a protected World Heritage Site. In just 4 days, this had become a full-spectrum war. So what did that fighting do? Well, it effectively redrew the map by force. Before all this, you had these disputed zones where there was let's call it a tense but functioning coexistence. But after just 4 days of heavy combat, all that ambiguity was just erased. Both sides were now claiming firm control over key temples and strategic hills, creating these violent, hardened front lines where there used to be just vague treaty lines. You know, behind every strategic move and every artillery barrage, there is a devastating human price. So now let's turn to the cost of this conflict for the ordinary people who were just caught in the middle. The scale of this is just immense. In total, across the initial clashes and then the renewed fighting later in the year, more than 500,000 civilians were displaced. Just think about that for a second. 500,000 people. Entire communities on both sides of that border uprooted from their lives as this war just engulfed their homes and their villages. And when you look at the data from just those first clashes in July, you see this really tragic symmetry. The death tolls were nearly identical. The number of people displaced on both sides was already well into the hundreds of thousands. And what this really tells you is that for the people living there, this wasn't some distant war fought by generals. It was a catastrophe that arrived right on their doorsteps. Okay, so we've seen the spark, that was the landmine, and we've seen the explosion, that 4-day war. But the real accelerant, the event that turned this crisis into a political inferno, didn't happen on any battlefield. No, it happened over a phone line. I mean, it really begs the question, right? What truly pushes two neighboring countries from a manageable border dispute into an outright war with airstrikes and martial law? Well, the answer lies in a single, secretly recorded, and very strategically released conversation. So on June 18th, just about a month before the fighting erupted, this unofficial call happens between Thailand's Prime Minister, Paetongtarn Shinawatra, and Cambodia's incredibly powerful Senate President, Hun Sen. And what happened next was just extraordinary. Hun Sen's team recorded the call and then deliberately leaked it to the public, creating an absolute political firestorm back in Thailand. And this was the line that did the damage. In a private call with a foreign leader whom many saw as an adversary, the Prime Minister of Thailand seemed to describe her own military as the opposing side. The political damage was immediate, and it was immense. It was seen as a total betrayal of her own armed forces. Just a stunning thing to say. And the fallout wasn't just political. You could feel it in the economy. The Thai stock market plummeted over 4% in just 3 days. And look, that's not just a number on a screen. It was a very real, very quantifiable collapse in investor confidence, in the stability of the Thai government itself. And the ultimate consequence was the fall of the government. After the leak, after all the public outcry, Thailand's constitutional court removed Paetongtarn Shinawatra from office. This political scandal had completely destabilized the country, right as military tensions were hitting a boiling point. So, with Thailand's government in complete turmoil and fighting raging on the border, the international community tried to step in. But as you're about to see, these efforts were pretty much a story of repeated failure. You can just see the pattern. A ceasefire is agreed to on July 28th, only to be breached in less than 24 hours. Then, in October, you get the Kuala Lumpur Accord, brokered by the US and ASEAN, and it offers some new hope. But by December, that deal had also completely collapsed amid renewed heavy fighting. Each breach just reveals this deep-seated mistrust that no piece of paper, no treaty could overcome. And right in the middle of these fragile peace attempts, you had declarations like this one. On July 26th, then U.S. President Donald Trump announced on his Truth Social platform that he had personally brokered a ceasefire. But as we just saw, the shooting did not stop. This post stands in such stark contrast to the reality on the ground, and it's this moment of dramatic irony that really highlights just how hard it was to enforce any kind of truth. So if diplomacy isn't working, to understand why the fighting unfolded the way it did, we have to look past the negotiating table and at the military strategy. Because this was not a fight between equals. Not at all. There was a really clear military imbalance here. On one hand, you have Thailand with a modern air force. We're talking American F-16s, Swedish Gripen jets, plus a powerful navy. On the other hand, you have Cambodia, which is primarily a land power. A big army, for sure, but with very limited air and naval capabilities. And this fundamental asymmetry would end up dictating the entire shape of the conflict. So the question then becomes, if you are that vastly superior military power, how do you actually leverage that advantage? How do you turn that on-paper superiority into a decisive reality on the battlefield?
Well, the answer was to fight where their opponent couldn't fight back. Thailand used its air power for precision strikes on Cambodian command centers and artillery positions. And at the exact same time, it used its powerful navy to control the Gulf of Thailand, shelling coastal provinces and opening up a second front that Cambodia had very few resources to defend.
Okay, so let's zoom out one last time, because a border war between two nations in Southeast Asia, well, it doesn't just stay regional, it sends ripples out across the entire globe. When the shooting started, the world's institutions really struggled to respond. ASEAN, the main regional body, was basically paralyzed by its core principle of non-interference. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council urged restraint, but it mostly chose to defer to that regional body, which effectively created a diplomatic vacuum. And with no one there to enforce the peace, the conflict was just allowed to fester. And into that vacuum stepped the great powers. The United States, which is a treaty ally of Thailand, used its economic leverage to push for ceasefires. At the same time, China, a close partner to both nations, played the role of a neutral friend to both sides, calling for restraint. But of course, beneath the surface, Beijing was very carefully protecting its own strategic interests in the region, including its access to Cambodia's Ream naval base. This created a very delicate geopolitical balancing act. And all of this leaves us with one final, crucial question. Was this just another tragic flare-up of an old border dispute, driven by domestic politics and nationalist pride? Or were we actually witnessing something more, the opening moves in a new geopolitical chess match, where these regional conflicts are becoming the proxy battlegrounds for the great powers of the 21st century?